Hi there, it's Dina, the shower genius, and I'm here today with Brad Szollose, who is a good friend and wonderful person, and he has his own amazing podcast called Awaken Nation. Welcome, Brad.
Dana, I am blown away. I'm the first guest on this show, and I love the idea, shower genius, because how many of us have we sing better in the shower, we think better in the shower, uh, everything's better in the shower. I have to agree. So I am honored.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Brad and I met years ago through a book we wrote in together, and we've stayed in touch, and I'm so glad that we have. But Brad, I want you to share with the audience your how you got started in business.
Well, it's kind of a fun story and a rough story, but I have a Hungarian stepfather who passed away back in 2012. But when I was growing up, he made it so hard to ask for a $20 bill that it was easier to start a business. Let's put it that way. And people laugh at that, but my dad was raised during the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hit, he was like, I think, 10 years old, and my grandparents came to America in 1921, the Hungarian side. And he basically, he raised me as if it was the Great Depression as well. So my father was cheap. To give you an example of how cheap he was, my bedroom, when I hit about 11, 12 years old, he decided to move it up to the attic. He fixed up the room, and he's very excited, and he showed me it. And the furniture was kind of odd. It was wooden, but it was modern looking. And here it was his woodshop project in high school during World War II. My dad built this, while Hitler was bombing Germany. My dad was building this furniture, and he brought it out for me during the Carter administration. So it forced me to start a business. It forced me to just learn from the very beginning that simple profit and loss, marketing, promotion, and then actually providing the service. And it was Disco Enterprise. That was my first business with two other buddies from high school. And they had already started the business. I just came on secondary at the end there. And I believe I took it to another level because I started doing the marketing, and I started doing a light show in the ceiling. And we didn't make great money, but we made enough money in the 70s and early 80s to put gas in the car. It was survival. So then I went off to college, and I graduated with a degree in visual communication, basically graphic design and advertising art and illustration. I moved to New York City, and I'm looking at that first paycheck. You get working at a design firm, and you're like, and folks, I want you to realize in 1981 or 1984, in around there, if you got out of college, your starting salary was about $18,000 a year. And some of you are probably going, "What? How could anybody live on that?" Well, that was life back then. That was enough to help you survive. Because rent was like, it could be like 500 a month. Rent wasn't that bad back then. So I'm in New York City. I'm working at this design firm, and I think in 4 years I went through two or three design firms, and every time it was time to lay people off because they made some sort of financial bad decision, they'd always fire the design part of the place. And I'm thinking, why are you doing that when we are directly billable to the client? And they would always keep the accountants, even though they weren't adding any value. They were just doing the accounting. And I realized I was in a profession where I could offer my talents on a freelance basis. Freelance comes from, the days of the knights of old, where you could go around and you offered your lance for a price, that you would do battle for a king or whoever, a noble. And so that's what I did. I offered my talents in New York City all over for a very specific niche in the design industry. And that is, I was doing big corporate meetings. And so those were slideshows. The bookings sometimes would be for 3 to 4 months, sometimes 9 months. I'd be working on one show for a pharmaceutical company or a car company, things like that. And I did pretty well with that, but that was me. That was a single proprietor model. And then years later, I had started another business that failed, and then I had another business, and that actually came out of a bit of serendipity. Um, One of my buddies from college, he had also moved to New York City. We started hanging out on the weekends, grabbing a beer, going to skiing together, hiking. I was even in his wedding party when him and his wife got married. We were close. And he turns around one day and he kept showing me these designs that he was doing on a Mac. And back then, design work was good on a Mac, but it wasn't great. You had to really work hard to make it professional. The handwork I was doing was still really good. And one day he comes up to me and he shows me a logo he did on a Mac. And I said, "Wow, that's pretty good. I better get a computer." So I bought a computer and I started teaching myself, Photoshop, Illustrator, and back then we used Quark for print. And I think it was about 2 or 3 years in. We hung out one night with one of his clients on Christmas Eve and around that weekend, before Christmas started in 1992. I remember it distinctly. And we're sitting in the car, and he's about to drive me back home because I lived near him. And he says, "Hey, I want to start a business with you." And I had just gotten out of my previous business partnership, and it was a mess. And I said, "Look, Doug, I don't want business partners anymore. I just went through hell." And I said, he goes, "No, I admire the work you do." And I said, "Well, maybe if you give me a list of 3 really good reasons, I'll consider it." And so he comes back a week later with like a list of 25 reasons to go into business with me. And I said, "You had me at hello," that kind of. And so now we had to come up with a name for the company. And we're sitting in my apartment. We're coming up with very pretentious, stuffy names, which back in the 90s, that's what you did. So we had like Bradley Douglas, very yuppie-ish sounding. And it was funny. Um, he's about to leave, and I look on the wall, and I got skis in the corner, and I got a picture of us on top of a mountain. I said, and we always loved, looking at Everest and all these other mountains around the world, these climbers, the dangers they went through. And I said, look at those names that we came up with. See if you like one of them. I mean, who knows? Maybe we want to call it K2, because my skis are in the corner. And he goes, and we both looked at each other, and literally we had chills on the back of our neck. And we went, "It's K2 Design. That's it. Boom." And we went down and we registered it February of 1993. And that's how it started. So to make a long story short, we started struggling that first year, and all we did was get clients from our 10 years of being in the design business. And so we had big clients, like we had Banco Popular, which was at one time the largest bank in the Western Hemisphere. We were doing their applications and things like that. And American Express had called us up through a contact I had at a previous studio. And so we were doing work for American Express Publishing. We were actually doing their sales pitch packets, and not in PowerPoint, but physical, where you like flip charts that they would fly out to pitch for advertisers to be in the magazines that they published. And that first year and a half, we were struggling. And then all of a sudden, he comes in one summer morning. He shows up with the New York Times under his shoulders, and he goes, "We have to become an internet company." And, I thought I was savvy. I just looked at him and go, "What the hell is the internet?" Remember, it's 1994, people. Don't judge. And back then, most people didn't know what the internet was. It was a static page, or it was email to them. They really didn't know what it was or what it was going to grow into. So with much reluctance, we started to become, that design firm that did graphical user interfaces. Well, we decided to send out a postcard, and anybody who's listening right now, I hope you take notes. You couldn't reach people on the internet yet because not enough people were on the internet. So we decided to create a postcard that actually said, "Click here to get on the World Wide Web." Imagine that, a printed piece. And we bought a mailing list and we mailed it out. Now, postcard mailers usually get a 4% return. Well, we got an 11% return. Okay. Our phone started ringing off the hook, and we started building bigger websites, and we had to hire programmers, and we had to learn beyond the graphical user interface, but site architecture and how to interact and the psychology of the end user. We had to learn all this as we were going because nobody knew what it was. We were reinventing the wheel. And we grew from that moment on 425% for 5 straight years. We attracted 2 more business partners. David Setner was our CEO, and he wound up getting us an IPO on NASDAQ. We went public on NASDAQ. So within 18 months of going, hey, let's become an internet company, we went public on NASDAQ, raised millions of dollars, had 60 employees, offices worldwide. And we were written up in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Cranes, Advertising Age, you name it, Forbes, Inc., all these magazines. All of a sudden, we're in the limelight. And, we were doing $4 million, $7 million, and then $9 million a year in business. And this all came about from an idea in a coffee shop where Doug and I sat down at my house and sketched everything out on a notepad, basically. And that's how I became a person who's been quoted and featured in Forbes magazine 6 times. And I'm a small town kid, who knows how to get cows off the road. Let's put it that way. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That's an awesome story. I don't think I've heard all of that ever before. So, but
Yeah.
how is it? How is it like going live on the stock market? Like, that's something I have not ever experienced.
Well, I didn't even know what an IPO was until, we started talking about it. I didn't know what a bubble was. That was the Clinton administration kind of poured money into, the Federal Reserve does it. They pour money into the
Mhm.
venture capitalists and banks, and, they give loans to businesses, and that matriculates out from there. And by the way, most of that money wound up in New York City, not on the West Coast. That's why it's called Silicon Alley instead of Silicon Valley in New York City, because we were getting loft spaces and all kinds of living the bohemian lifestyle, but making millions in these beautiful lofts that nobody wanted to be in. We chose them because they had big spaces, but it was the Wild West back then because we would only go after big fish. And this is the thing I want a lot of people to think about. In those early days when we started to retool to become an internet company, we had to look bigger than we were in order to attract bigger clients. So this happened. Doug was hilarious because he has a print background. My business partner at the time, Doug Cleek. Um, we went to this I think it was American Express. Let's put it this way. It was a big corporation. And we watched the buyer on the other side who would buy graphic design services, print, everything else, take our business card and kind of slam it into the desk. Some people have this nervous habit. They don't know they do. And he was just like doing this with our business card. And Doug got so ticked off about it. He went back to the office and we designed business cards that were so heavy. They were almost as thick as a credit card. So when a person would get the card, they realized it was expensive, first of all, to print these. They were on Star White Vicksburg, which is a heavy paper, pure white, bleach white, and it was 100-pound stock. So you couldn't really fold it easily. And we'd hand those out, and people were like, whoa. And they immediately were like, the image we were presenting was, we're a small firm. We have, decent clients. And people would ask us, how many people work for you? And we lied. We said 12. And so we had a client that we had on the hook. They came down to the office, and we had to have like 6 of our friends come down and pretend they worked there. And then we said the rest of the crew was out on sales calls, and we have a freelancer, which not all of it was a lie. We did have freelancers working for us. We had some art getting done, and we did have 2 salespeople. But they brought their wives in to work for us for the day. And that happened. And then the other thing that happened is Doug had a connection with a guy who was in banking. And Doug, in his previous job, he had been designing applications and posters for banks. And he was also doing high-end hotel chains with restaurants and doing all their work in multiple languages. So this guy called us up and he says, "Hey, I have a new position. I'm over at Banco Popular." And he came down to our offices to meet us. And we got along right away because he was a big, tall Irishman, Irish American, liked to go out for a beer. And when he came down to our offices, we had just renovated this tiny little 9 by 12 office. Picture this. He's going to give us a very large, like 6-figure contract. Uh, Basically, and we have a little 9 by 12 office. So he looked at our office. He was satisfied. He turned around and goes, "Let's go out for a beer." And that was it. He brought us in and he said, "Here, I want you guys to design our brochures." So we started working on these applications and coming up with designs, and they were really cool. And you have to realize Banco Popular, most of their depositors were Spanish speaking. So we wanted to do what's called all of the brochures and everything. They couldn't just be done in regular Spanish. They had to be done in what's called Nuyorican. And this is an actual language. It's a mosh of Puerto Rican Spanish with New York City slang. So you really have to know how to write for that kind of language. And so we hired somebody. We had him on the hook. If we got the job, we were going to hire him to decipher everything, to do it in English and Nuyorican. And so we were all excited. And then we had a day we were supposed to go down and show him the work we did. So your audience is going to love this story. We show up at this high rise and we're sitting in the lobby, and Doug and I are, we're just, we're in suits. We're dressed kind of nice. But nothing major. And we're not nervous. We're not, we're just, we're going to show our designs to Ed. Well, these two people come out, and Ed, the guy who had, was going to hire us, he's walking two other people out. He introduces us to these two people, a man and a woman. We shake hands. They also have a portfolio, and they walk out the door. And Doug just looks at me after Ed walks away, and he goes, "Do you know who that was?" I go, "What? I don't know." He goes, "Those two people were from the largest design firm in all of New York City." We were in what's called a pitch fest. So that means for the next 9 hours or 6 hours, whatever they were going to do, they were going to see 3 to 5 different companies to pitch their ideas for Banco Popular's all new launch of their brochures and their posters. And so we walk in, and I had created this accordion folded portfolio piece that, as you showed each piece, it would unfold. And by the time it was the length of the table, it would be unfolded and they could see all the designs as one. And it would just, layer by layer. And so we go in, we sit down. We hadn't rehearsed anything, Dina. And all of a sudden, we look across the table, and there's two old-fashioned, waspy bankers. And then there's two other executives who were clearly not happy that they had lost their jobs in Puerto Rico and were now forced to live in New York City where it's cold. So we have the Latinos on one side and the WASPs on the other, and there was tension there. And I spoke just enough of Spanish to kind of bridge the gap a little bit. And Doug and I are sitting there, and Doug goes, "Well, we came up with these designs, and we're going to do this and this and this. And but Brad's going to lead the rest of the presentation." And I looked over at him, and I gave him that look that only friends can give. And it's like, USOB, I am going to kick your butt later. And we turned around, and I just started talking. And I go, "Now, we chose black on this, and we had all these swashes of color because your depositors, they like color, they like fiesta, they like fun, but also it's the serious side. And by the way, on these comps that we did, do you know how hard it was to find a Latino family buying a house back in 1994? Do you know how hard it was to find interracial couples doing banking business? We must have spent 7 to 8 hours every day for 4 days to go through archive footage just to find this stuff. So it was a lot of work. We loved doing it, and we won the account, and it was probably about $275,000. But it still wasn't enough. But when we became an internet company, holy crap, everything took off. That was really what changed everything.
That's awesome. I think it's so I like that you talk about the early part of growing a company because, a lot of times when we get to know companies, they've already been,
Yeah.
they've already scaled and they already have 60 or hundreds of employees, and that's how we get to know them. But
Yeah.
similarly, in my event company I had, I started by myself and I grew 200 to 300% for several years in a row. And then I
Right.
had 5 employees, and then I had 30 contractors around the state. And then, and it's like the people who saw me towards the end of that, and we were winning awards left and right, they didn't necessarily understand that beginning part. So it's
Yeah.
important,
It
especially
is.
for people who are trying to start something themselves, and they think that they're the only one who's going through that.
Well, it's interesting. I still have employees to this day who think, I just showed up, and they don't know that for 2 years, me and Doug struggled before David came along, and then Matt DeGannon. And they don't know we slept in the office one night, to get a job done, and the building we were in closed at 10 o'clock, and then they would kick you out of the building. So we had to pretend we weren't there. We had bought all our food earlier, and we had snacks and everything. We had brought toothbrushes, and we just fired everything back up at like 2 in the morning and started working. Our back then we didn't have laptops, so you'd have to take your whole PCs, all both our PCs. We had to load them up in the car on a Friday at 5, go home, and then over the weekend meet at each other's apartments to do design work. I mean, this was crazy back then, but you do what you have to do to make the business succeed. And probably one of the best stories I have is when we first discovered we could design, the graphical user interface. We created an animated presentation to show what a website would look like on Netscape. Because back then we didn't have Wi-Fi back then, and you definitely couldn't plug into the wall of any office you walked into. So we made this can demo, and we started going around with a laptop, which was a newfangled device in 1994, 1995. And we would show them, the internet. We'll build your website. This is what we'll do. We'll have hypertext links. We'll leave breadcrumbs along the site. And at the end of every presentation, they go, "Hey, could you make that for our sales team?" They weren't interested in getting on the internet. They wanted a presentation like that. And this went on for months. We'd show our regular physical portfolio with print work and things. And as soon as we got to the internet part, people's eyes would glaze over like they didn't know what we were talking about. And then all of a sudden, we were pitching to a much older executive. And instead of his eyes glazing over, he turned around and he said, "Hey, could you make a CD-ROM hybrid that would launch a proprietary browser that would take us to a password-protected section of our website for our next annual report? Could you guys do that? Could you? Could you do that?" And we're like sitting there looking at him like the dog just spoke, because for 3 months, nobody could answer our questions. And this guy knew it. And this started happening, one executive after another. 3 months of no sales, and all of a sudden, boom, this guy gets it, hired us. Then the next one hired us. And we started to notice that if the executive or the person in charge had gray hair, they all had the same answer. They knew all about the internet, CD-ROMs, things like this. And we were like, "Well, how do you know so much about this?" They said, "Our grandkids here every weekend, grandkids," we go, "Grandma, Grandpa, come here and watch." They'd launch a CD-ROM, they'd play a video game, and then that video game or that game would take them to a website where they would initiate a sale, a mock sale, because it was children. So, they could get more coins, and then they could play more games. And they started to realize this gamification was taking place even before we called it gamification. And that's how we won the CD-ROM hybrid for JP Morgan Chase's bank for their 1996 annual report. That was a $250,000 job right out of the gate. We had animation on it, everything. Our whole staff was working on it for months. But that's how we won things. We started asking deeper questions because we couldn't figure out why gray-haired executives were making all these, quick decisions. And from that moment on, you're going to laugh at this, Dina. Those executives and those buyers that for a year before didn't know what we were talking about suddenly were calling us because their executives were now demanding that they now get a website built. And every website we touched was between $300,000 and $500,000 minimum. And so we grew exponentially, to a staff of 60 very quickly because we'd have 5, 10 projects like this. I just want to say to your listeners, those who are maybe small businesses right now you're relying on yourself to be the business and your talents are going into it. But I'm going to say this: did you create a job or are you creating a business? And so you can only grow to the size that you have inside you. The limitations in you are going to be reflected in the business. And if you don't have a certain skill, you may need to hire somebody or make a business partner part of that plan that does have the skill that you're missing. But your skill sets must overlap. Like me and Doug, graphic design and the need and want to do really great work was the overlap. My skill set was I already knew how to run a business. I knew how to do the bookkeeping, file everything for the IRS, marketing, getting the word out about us. Doug knew about international design for banks, for hotel chains, restaurants. Some of the things we worked on in the beginning, they were in 5 and 6 different languages for one hotel. So you're looking at some very complex work, but that overlap was the most important part. And yes, we fought over design. We fought over how the business would be run. We fought over different things because Doug and I were two roosters with nobody to manage. We're walking around trying to manage each other. That doesn't work. But that special milieu of argumentativeness and the need to be great at creative and putting out the best product is what helped us survive until we had people to manage. And once we had people to manage, we figured out our own methodology, which we won an award for, by the way. Arthur Anderson gave us an award for fostering innovation amongst our employees. And so we didn't know what we were doing was so special, but it was enough to get an award.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a really good bridge into what you talk about in the workplace about different generations.
Yeah. Well, some people, they've asked me, well, how did you become a generational expert? Well, it's because of our management model. It satisfied this new generation that, quite frankly, I'm a baby boomer and I'm sitting there 25 years ago going, what the hell's wrong with this generation? Because they didn't want to work. They wanted to work from home. They wanted to do all kinds of stuff that had never been seen before. And they were telling me off. It's like, hey, you know what insubordination is, right? And we created a very different management model, which I decided to write about in my first book, Liquid Leadership. And I basically started to realize the graphic design and the advertising agency field, they work on what's now called a ROW model, results only work environments. And so it satisfies their need to, you give them a deadline, the very best have to, hustle and bustle to meet that deadline. And they kind of love that kind of, you have to prove yourself on every project. Instead of a bunch of rules and a flat hierarchy, we would bring programmers and designers together and go through an ideation session or, a whiteboard on what the project would look like. And then we'd all go off and create our pieces. And we'd have one production manager in the center managing, the cattle drive we were doing every day. And that gave people the freedom to come and go as they needed to, and they could get their work done. We didn't care how you got the work done as long as you got it done and you showed progress. We're not going to reward people who screw off for, a month and then in the last week they try to get everything done. But the results only management model works. It works really, really well cross generationally. So when I was writing Liquid Leadership, I traveled around the country and interviewed a lot of people, probably over 100 interviews. And one of the things that I found was the biggest and deepest influence for this next generation was video games. And boomers weren't listening to me in the beginning, so I had to get props. And so I would come out on stage and I would show the GAF Viewmaster, which is making a comeback, by the way. And I would show this and I'd say, hey, this was the most interactive device that a baby boomer could use. And then I'd pull out the Nintendo 64 game controller And I'd say, "Hey, do you think our brains might work differently?" And that's when everybody would stop arguing with me and go, "Oh, this generation is like, Elroy from the Jetsons.
That's it.
He's working with nuclear fission while we're sitting here complaining. Why is my kid, on a video game every day? He's actually learning skills for the future. He's actually working with a computer. Gamification is very interesting, and I did a TED talk about this. I did a TED talk that kind of explained this is how we're solving problems in the 21st century. We're using gamification and game design as a reward, a task reward, paradigm for everything from consumers to employees. We just don't know it, but it's designed into it. So I wrote Liquid Leadership really to educate people about what I went through as a baby boomer to wake up to this whole new paradigm where a new generation is actually working in economies that we can't see, like the game world,
Mhm.
and how to manage people in the 21st century, what to look for with technology. And so that book put me on the map as a speaker and as somebody who could be on a podcast and things like that. So if you have done something extraordinary, write a book about it and watch what happens. Because the surprise that came out of this, Dina, you're going to laugh, wasn't so much the business part. People didn't hire me so much for the business coaching part. They hired me for the parenting part. This is the weird part. I had somebody stand in line at a keynote that I did to get his book signed that he had bought from me. And I said, "Do you want business coaching?" He goes, "Oh, no, I don't need your business coaching." And at first I was insulted. He said, "I need you to teach me how to speak to my 6-year-old." So we went on. I had a series of phone calls with him where I told him how to really bond with his child now, because they're like little baby sphinsters. And if you're a boomer, you know what a baby sphinster is. It's from a Bugs Bunny cartoon where this little person robbed a bank, and he decided to disguise himself as a baby while he was still smoking cigars. And so you have a wunderkind, as we say in German, Wunderkind, which is an advanced kid, super kid who really understands technology and
Mhm.
workflow environments and profit and loss. And yeah, so that's
That's
what happened.
crazy. It's
My,
crazy.
my brain used to hurt at the end of the day. Let me tell
Yeah.
you that.
I actually saw Bugs Bunny the other day, and I hadn't seen that on TV in so long. Oh, it was my husband and I were laughing at it. But I want to ask you a question about all the time you've spent in business and owning businesses. What, if anything, have you done to take care of yourself?
That's an interesting story because I didn't for the longest time. When I left K2, actually just before I left K2, I I got into the gym. I'd been working 95 hours per week minimum, and then when you go home and you own your own business and it's publicly held, you really can't shut it off. You're still thinking about the business, you're still navigating, thinking strategy, thing like that. So it was very hard to relax. And so I started going back to the gym, and I'm lifting weights, and I'm a pretty strong person. And after about 2 weeks, I realized I'm not getting stronger. I can barely lift, 35-pound weights in each arm in a bench press. I usually can do, 150 to work out, just, and I'm like, what is going on? And I realized I needed to go see a doctor. So I went to a naturopath. I don't go to regular doctors because, if I went into a regular doctor, they would just look at me and they go, you're fine for your age. And back then I was about to hit 40 and I was weak. And my naturopath came back after working on me for an hour. He did iridology, checking through the eye parameters, and then backing it up with reflexology. He says, I have good news and bad news. And I still remember his accent to this day. He's from East Africa. Uh, he goes, he goes, you have the internal organs of an 85-year-old man. I said, how the hell did that happen? He says, stress. He says, you did not take care of yourself over the last, what, 4 or 5 years? I said, yeah. I said, stress did that to me? He goes, yeah. And he goes, but I can reverse it. And so he put me on a regimen of herbs and acupuncture and a bunch of other things. And within a month, he got me back to probably about 26 years of age. But I couldn't believe how quickly, and this was my first lesson, real lesson in how naturopathic medicine, if done right with herbs and all these other things, is actually far superior to our Western medicine model of surgery and drugs. And I was raised, my dad was a chiropractor, as you know. And so I was raised in this environment, but also my best friend across the street, his dad was a general practitioner and a surgeon. So I sat directly between the two environments of natural medicine and Western medicine.
Mhm.
And actually, most of my freelance career and a lot of the people I've worked with through the years were pharmaceutical companies. And I understand, if you break your arm, you go to a regular doctor. You don't mess around with that. Or if you have pneumonia, you go to the hospital. But if you want to really age slowly and you want to be healthy, and while everybody around you is getting sick, but you're not, naturopathic doctors, that's the way to go. Because if I went to a regular doctor right now, I'm 62 years old. Do I look 62? No. Do I run up a set of stairs sometimes better than 20-year-olds? Yes. They're vaping all the time. I'm not. And so I don't have aches and pains. All my friends from high school, they're complaining about their knees and things like this. Meanwhile, I'm just standing around like I don't understand why people are in pain. And it all boils down to I take care of my body a certain way. And it's and this is a shout out to the late great Dr. Iran Josan. He healed me up, and through the years, I would always go to him. And I keep going to naturopaths, and I test them because I know just enough to go, okay, what do I need to do to reverse this? And if they don't give me the right answer, then I ain't going to them. And I've also graduated to another level. My fiance and I, we're actually into energy devices as well. So there's now energy devices that they've kind of poo pooed for 100 years, but they're now slowly integrating them into Western medicine because they work. So, things like plasma machines and things like that. So, getting back to, what we were talking about, I learned that I have to be very careful with certain foods. And I'm not perfect, okay? I go to In-N-Out Burger once in a while, okay? But I will not go to McDonald's or Burger King or any of those. We see, when we're exhausted at the end of the day and we're just like, okay, let's have a treat. 9 out of 10 times we will go, if we're going to get fast food, we go to an actual beef taco truck here in Vegas, where they cook it, grandma's behind the kitchen. They're making the tacos fresh. They're making everything from scratch. None of this fast food junk. And most of the time we do what's called a paleo keto kind of diet. So, I'll have, I eat a lot of beef because I am blood type O. You can look up blood typing diets if you want. But there's also something called the metabolic typing diet. And you can look at up the Metabolic Kitchen by Jane Durst Polkes. That's a phenomenal book. It'll teach you how to eat properly. And she also works with clients. You send your blood in. She has a testing lab she'll send you to. And when she analyzes your blood, she'll tell you what nutrients are missing and what you need to eat more of. So it's more customizable. But the thing I found is everything mainstream science tells us, don't do. I hate to say it. When the government starts telling you, don't go out in the sun, well, how come the wealthiest people in the world are always in the sun? Sitting on their yachts, enjoying their free. Even the Queen of England, before she died, she lived longer than any other queen that has ever existed and reigned longer than anybody else. She had 3 naturopathic doctors working for her, and she was always out in the sun. She had a little hat on, but she would go out in the sun all the time. It's because the sun heals us. But the doctors here, they tell you, oh, the sun's not good for you. Is it? Or is it the stuff we're slathering on our skins to keep the sunlight from healing us? And is it all the chemicals in our food that's rising up into the skin? And when we go out in the sun, it bakes that into our skin. That's what's causing cancer, not sunlight. And I stopped using, tanning solutions and, what we call it, SPF 30 and all this nonsense. Um, Guess what? If you get a sunburn, do you know what is really causing that? The lack of copper in your blood. You need to take more copper. So Americans are deficient in copper, magnesium, B1, B6, zinc, and calcium. Did I mention magnesium? Yes. All those were in there. So if you take magnesium and you don't have copper with it, it's not going to help calcium fuse to your bones. Do you know there's 20 causes of disease and death that are directly attributed to copper deficiency? And so when I started taking copper, my gray hair went away. I used to have all white hair. My hair was pure white everywhere. I was like Bill Clinton. Hi, how you doing? Good to see you. Um, all over, I had white hair. And I started taking copper, and wrinkles went away. The white went away. I'm a little gray on the sides. Big whoop. I don't care. But what is happening? Gray hair is a sign that, like an organ, like your heart, is sucking the nutrition from your hair and your scalp because it's not getting the right nutrition. And so I've had Dr. Wallach on my podcast and Dr. Randy Shannon, and they basically tell me there are 122 nascent minerals that we need to take every day that was found in the Blue Zone study, including selenium, that will prevent everything from heart attacks to cancer. And you also have to take it with your essential fatty acids and get some exercise and get some sunlight. And that's what I've learned in the last, 40 years?
I agree with you. I have worked with a lot of naturopathic people too, and one particular doctor who saved my dad's life in 2020 when he was about to have triple bypass surgery. But I also have a copper water bottle. You need one of those.
Yeah. You can, yeah, copper water bottles are really, really good for you because that particular metal energizes your water, believe it or not. Just drinking water can be dangerous. Most of the waters we have right now are in plastic bottles. They're not alkaline. And when you drink them, they're actually causing problems and damaging you inside because they're too acidic. I learned this the hard way, but yeah, you can't drink tap water. It's filled with chlorine, which, by the way, causes broken hips, brittle bones, things like that, osteoporosis. The chlorine in our tap water is causing this. Whereas fluoride, when you take too much fluoride, drinking it, I'm not talking about dentists putting it on your teeth once in a while. I'm talking about drinking the actual chemical, which is a byproduct of the aluminum industry and is the first ingredient in rat poison, by the way. Fluoride, when you drink it, it actually does something to the blood-brain barrier. For thousands of years, the human race, you couldn't get certain chemicals or poisons into the brain because the blood-brain barrier would block any dangerous things from getting to your brain. That's why, when you see people get bitten by a snake, their cognitive functions are fine, but their body's dying, because the poison can't get to the brain yet. And so what has happened now is we've had, a century of fluoride in our drinking water. And it does two things. It allows metals and chemicals and all sorts of things to pass through the blood-brain barrier into the brain. That has never happened before. And the second thing that fluoride does is it causes over 55 different diseases and cancers. And there's people all over the world, doctors, who are railing against fluoride. And our politicians seem to just love putting fluoride in the water because it does a third thing. It lowers your cognitive awareness of things. It makes you complacent. So people they've proven this, you can look it up. When they give fluoride to people, it lowers their IQ. Okay. So when you go to Starbucks and you get a beautiful cup of coffee, they've heated up the water, and chances are that water has fluoride in it. and that goes right into your system. It is not making your bones stronger. As a matter of fact, if you take too much fluoride, it makes your bones brittle. Okay? So these are some of the things that you have to try and avoid. We also have a reduction in testosterone in our society, and I hate to be on a soapbox, but they say by the year 2030, our sperm count will be so low amongst men in the United States, we will actually be in a crisis mode of not having children. So all these things are affecting us. Our modern world is really killing us at the endocrine level. It's
Mhm.
really very destructive. So we almost have to reject what mainstream science is telling us and go back to traditional medicine, which is this 5,000-year-old art of staying healthy and being in dying without having to have a cane or hip surgery.
Yeah. Well, I think to your point about fluoride and aluminum is what they've proven cause Alzheimer's and
Yep.
dementia. And and there's just so many bad things in everything we consume, whether it's air, water, soil right now.
Yeah.
It's just everything. You go to the store and buy fruit and it doesn't even look real. Um,
Well, well, how many of you have noticed that when you bring produce home, it goes bad quicker than it used to when we were kids? We used to have a little potato bin when I was a kid over by the stove down below. It was dark and it was it, and you could go in there for a month and pull out a potato or two or whatever we wanted to have for dinner. Now, try sitting your potatoes in an environment like that. They get these big bruised blotches on them inside. You're like, what is going on? And it's part and parcel because they have aluminum and other things in the soil now.
mhm,
People don't realize this is ruining our regular crops, and it's going to force people to have to get GMOs. And I think that's part of the plan. I hate to be a conspiracy theorist on your show, but our health is so important. We have to read every ingredient on every box. And I've come to the
mhm.
conclusion if it's in a box, it's not healthy. Um, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I agree.
Hmm.
What a great conversation. Thank you for all your contributions to our
Absolutely.
listeners today. And I have two questions for you for us to end on.
Sure.
And one is, what is the best idea you've had in the shower?
Well, I sing really well in the shower. I don't think I sing really well in real life. Uh, Although my Elvis impersonation isn't bad. Um, I think I look at my podcast right now, Awakened Nation, and that came out of kind of going, I don't want to do a podcast. You know what I mean? I
Mhm.
don't know about you, but I was asked to be a guest and a host on probably about 100 podcasts. And I was just like, I'm tired of these stupid conversations where people are like, I'm so successful. Let me tell you how successful I am. And I remember standing with a buddy of mine, Chris Salem, and he knows about this. Um, he said, "Hey, I want to be on your podcast." And I usually don't have friends on my podcast unless they're doing something extraordinary like you. And I said, "Well, if you're going to be on my podcast, we have to talk about your alcoholism." And he said, "Oh, absolutely. We're going to talk about my alcoholism, my narcotics addiction, my rageaholic, my sex addiction, my dad issues, everything." He says it's the foundation of all the work I'm doing today. I said, "Good, you're on the show." Um, and I guess I was in the shower and I'm literally thinking to myself, I just want to do something different, something that has meaning for me, something that fires me up and excites me. And I hope that people who listen, they're really excited by the guests I interview because I'm not going to ask regular questions. So Awaken Nation really came out of me being resistant to it and finally finding what has meaning to me, uh, which is I want to have a deep dive into extraordinary conversations.
Yeah,
It's like the difference. It's like Art Bell meets Joe Rogan. That's me.
yeah, that's awesome. And Awaken Nation is amazing. So if you
Thanks.
guys aren't listening to it, you should. Um, and my other question doesn't really make sense now, but it was, how did that idea change things for you? But you kind of explained that already.
Honestly, I've had to eat some humble pie because that first those first 18 episodes, the sound went out. God bless Bob Berg. He came on, and he it took a half an hour to get the sound right, and I had just bought a new microphone, this one right here. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me! And I went on regular AirPod buds or whatever, and
Mhm.
those first episodes, the sound is horrible. I cringe, and then sometimes I don't know if I can put this in a way that maybe everyone can understand, but when you put yourself in a position where you're starting a business, or you're starting a podcast, or you're doing something so brand new that you just love it, but a lot of people don't understand what you're doing. They may even mock you for it.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, you get phone calls from people in Australia that go, "Hey, can you put one of my people on your show?" Or you get an introduction to a celebrity that you've only dreamed that you could get on your show, or you could work with somebody that was completely outside of the realm of you even having it as a possibility.
Mhm.
Those are the blessings that I look at and I just say, thank you, God. I am blown away that I am standing on a path that gives me access to extraordinary people. And it's not always celebrities, it's regular people doing extraordinary things to change our world because they are passionate and believe in it. Um, I had Belinda Carlisle on my show, and we talked about her cocaine addiction that almost killed her over a weekend. And she tried to negotiate with God over that. She heard a deep voice said, "Hey, if you keep doing this, you're going to be dead." And she says, "Can I just finish this pack right here?" you know. And then she talked about her Kundalini awakening. And I was like, that's crazy. It's like, wow, to go and heal yourself at such a level. Um, uh, I feel blessed. That's all I have to say. Astounded and blessed, and in a state of wonder sometimes when I interview people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
being my first guest.
I am honored, Dina. The things you are doing, the changes you're making, helping people to go from scars to stars. That's an incredible service that you offer people, and I love that you're bringing authors together and people who've gone through extraordinary circumstances and came out on the other side, um, so much more alive, vibrant, and awake, as they say.
That's true. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dina.